So this is the next psychopathology lesson. We're looking at OCD, characteristics and explanations for this. It's on paper 1 along with memory, social and attachment. Characteristics of OCD is where we'll start. So we've got cognitive characteristics. These are obsessions and intrusive thoughts. An example of an intrusive thought could be contamination. So you could be worried that you're constantly going to be contaminated by germs, or you could think that you're going to contaminate other people, something along those lines. And this would go through your mind constantly. Behavioural characteristics, we have compulsions, which help relieve anxiety. So these are actions that are carried out such as repeatedly checking, so constantly checking that you've locked the front door or that your oven's turned off, or hand washing, so constantly washing your hands. Often there's a number associated to this, so an individual will feel like they need to check something a certain number of times, or wash their hands a particular number of times also. Then we have emotional characteristics such as embarrassment and shame. So lots of individuals who suffer from OCD often hide this because they are embarrassed of this, and they feel shameful, like it's something that they shouldn't have. They also have feelings of anxiety, so because they all constantly have this urge and this obsession with repeating the behaviour or these intrusive thoughts, that can add to their anxiety that they're already suffering with. And also disgust, so this could be that they feel that they are disgusting, or it could be that they feel other things are disgusting and therefore they might avoid certain situations because of that. So just to recap, we have cognitive, behavioural and emotional characteristics. Cognitive characteristics are obsessions and intrusive thoughts. Behavioural characteristics are compulsions. These can be checking behaviours or hand washing. And then emotional characteristics are anxiety, disgust, shame or embarrassment. So it can be any combination of those. Now we're going to look at explanations for OCD. So we're going to focus on the biological explanation for OCD. So just a little recap. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to see what you can remember about the biological approach. So list some key words that you can remember, see if you can explain those key words, and then check those, and then think about how the biological approach could be used to explain abnormal behaviours. So what key words have you written down, and how can we link those key words to OCD, for example? Okay, so with regards to the biological approach, you should have the idea that it's focusing on how we might inherit characteristics, and how biological characteristics, so things within us, how this can affect our behaviour. So an example of this might be genes, or hormones, or neurotransmitters, or neural things, so areas of our brain, for example. So we're going to focus on a couple of explanations. The first one is genetic and then the second one is neural. So the genetic explanation is a biological explanation of OCD. And we've got two genes that have been linked to OCD, the SERT gene and the COMT gene. So pause this and take some notes. So the SERT gene is a gene that affects serotonin, and if this gene is present, it could mean that an individual has lower levels of serotonin. There's a study to support this, and they found that there was a mutation of this gene in 2 unrelated families where 6 of the 7 members had OCD. So this suggests that it runs in families, and it could therefore be inherited, and it could be biological. The next one, the COMT gene, this is involved in production of dopamine. Okay, so if someone has different levels of dopamine, so this can affect whether they have OCD or not. So again, we've got here the idea that a version of this gene has been found to be more common in OCD patients. So this could be that there's an issue with this gene that is inherited, and this therefore means that that individual has higher levels of dopamine, and if they have higher levels of dopamine, it could link to them having OCD. So these two genes, the research that supports them suggests that these genes can be inherited and that these genes are linked to OCD. However, in addition to that, you'll see the SCRT gene is linked to serotonin levels and the COMT gene is linked to dopamine levels. So it could be that an individual doesn't have these genes, but they still have abnormal levels of serotonin and dopamine. And that's where we come on to our next explanation. And this is the role of neurotransmitters. So these two link together really well. So here we've got this idea that someone with high levels of dopamine might develop OCD. So we've got this support here, which is animal studies, and this shows that if you give rats an injection that increases their levels of dopamine, then they start to develop checking behaviours, which are similar to OCD patients. Obviously, they're not going to be exactly the same because these are rats, and rats are different to humans in terms of their cognitions, so we've got that little issue there, but it does show that there potentially is a link between levels of dopamine and compulsive behaviours. Then we have the role of serotonin. So like we've just mentioned with the SCRT gene, someone could not have that gene, but they could actually have lower levels of serotonin. And this again is associated with OCD. So we've got some research here to support that. And this is the idea that if we give someone an antidepressant, which increases serotonin activity, such as an SSRI, then it could help reduce someone's OCD symptoms. This therefore suggests that lower levels of serotonin are linked to OCD. We can't say that it's definite, so you have to remember, with all of the explanations that we're using here, we can't say that it proves that it is one thing or another. We can't prove that it's biological. We can just suggest. So we can just suggest that serotonin and dopamine have a role with regards to OCD. It could be a combination of both factors, or it could be just one. So our final biological explanation is to do with our brain and the functions within our brain, and this links to abnormal brain circuits. So researchers suggested that lots of areas of the frontal lobes are thought to be abnormal in someone with OCD. So you can see from the image there that we've got a normal control, and then we've got someone with obsessive compulsive disorder. And you can see that the individual with OCD, they have lots of areas of high activity within that frontal lobe. And within the frontal lobe, there's an area called the caudate nucleus. This has been linked to OCD. This area of the brain suppresses signals from your orbitofrontal circuit. So basically, in your frontal circuit, your frontal lobe is to do with detecting a threat. So someone with OCD, they have this area of their brain, and normally what would happen is the caudate nucleus, when you start to worry about something, the caudate nucleus is activated. And when that is activated, it suppresses this worrying and it stops you worrying. So it says, okay, this isn't something that we need to worry about, it's not a threat, we'll stop worrying about it. So someone with OCD, actually, some researchers found that they have damage to this area. If they therefore have damage to this area, then it means that this nuclei, it's not stopping the worrying, and an individual might constantly worry about something because their brain's not working and it's not switching this off. It's not saying, okay, we don't need to worry about this anymore. It can't do that, it's not functioning correctly, and therefore an individual might continue to worry. Okay, so just to recap, for our biological explanations of OCD, we've got genetic, which is the SCRT gene, which is linked to lower levels of serotonin, and the COMT gene, which is linked to an increase in dopamine. Then we have neural explanations. Our first neural explanation is the idea that we might have high levels of dopamine, which could be linked to OCD, and we've got the rat study to support that. Or an individual could have lower levels of serotonin, which again is linked to OCD, and the research to support that comes from the use of antidepressants. Then our final neural explanation is the idea of the caudate nucleus or the orbitofrontal cortex. And this is the idea that the frontal cortex of an individual suffering from OCD isn't working properly, and therefore they're consistently worrying because their brain can't turn that worry off. Okay, so we've been through the biological explanations for OCD. Now we're going to look at some evaluation points. First of all, we've got some research support. So there's little bits of research support throughout the different biological explanations, so you can choose to use a couple of those, but then we've got some bigger studies here. So the first one looks at 80 patients with OCD and their first degree relatives. This is like brothers and sisters. And they found that when they compared them to control patients who didn't have mental illness and their relatives, the people with OCD, if you had a first degree relative with OCD, you were 5 times more likely to have the illness yourself. The second study looked at twins and found that identical twins were more than twice as likely to develop OCD if their co-twin also had the disorder. And this was higher than if they were non-identical twins. So both of these pieces of research suggest that it could be something that is inherited. It could be something that's passed down throughout families. However, and I'll come on to this point in a little bit more detail later on, if we're looking at twins and first degree relatives, they're likely to share the same environment. And it could therefore be that because someone is in the same environment, that means that they are more likely to imitate one another. So through social learning theory, or there could be a behavioural explanation for OCD, and it could be that it's the environment that's causing them to have OCD, not the genetics. And it's hard to separate the two in terms of when we're trying to explain it. So in your paper 3 actually, we discuss issues and debates, and OCD or any of the parts of psychopathology are really good to use with regards to the nature-nurture debate, particularly this one because we're looking at a biological explanation. So this is a good, these pieces of research are good to reuse if you're talking about nature-nurture, which we will do when we get onto that in paper 3. So some strengths of this explanation. Because it's a biological explanation, we could say that it's ethical because we don't blame people for their disorder. So it's not your fault, it's something that you've been born with, and that can sometimes help an individual accept this. Also, because it's biological, we have a scientific methodology, so therefore we can see that there's some clear correlations between biology and OCD. It therefore gives the scientific explanation, it gives psychology more credibility. So when you're talking about psychology as a science, you can bring some of this in as well, and you can use OCD to support that, and this idea that we can develop biological treatments because we're using a scientific methodology. So these biological treatments for OCD are also a strength, it's a positive thing. So then we've got some limitations. Because the evidence is correlational, we can't establish cause and effect. So it could be that there's something else causing OCD, so it could be irrational thinking, or it could be social learning, it could be something like that that's causing the OCD, but we're not focusing on that because we've found this correlation, okay? But we can't say because there's a link between OCD and serotonin, that's what causes it. This is why we shouldn't use the word prove in psychology, because we can just say that there's a link, we can't say that that is the definite cause. Also, the explanation doesn't take into account the role of the environment, so that's what I've just mentioned. Because of this, it's reductionist. It's only focusing on one explanation, and this is something that we can link into our issues and debates again when we focus on that in paper 3. But it's just this idea that it's not saying that the environment has any role whatsoever, but it's hard to separate the role of the environment from your biology, particularly if we're looking at twins or first degree relatives. Another limitation is that the drugs that we use to treat OCD might raise ethical issues, so they can be addictive, or it could be that they just suppress the symptoms and they don't actually help us treat an individual. And this could be because the disorder could come back, it could manifest itself, the individual could have a relapse, because we're just focusing on like, right, these are the symptoms, we've got a biological treatment for it, let's give you some antidepressants, but actually you're not focusing on solving the problem because it could be caused by something else, like I mentioned earlier, such as irrational thinking. So the final thing is a further evaluation, and this is a really good evaluation point to link in with that nature-nurture debate for paper 3. So if you look here, the concordance rates are never 100%. So when we're looking at twin studies, we never find out that there's 100% concordance rate. So we can't say that 100% of their behaviour is caused by their genes. It's often much lower than that. Sometimes it's within the region of 50% or less. So this means that we have to take into account the role of the environment. A good explanation could be the Diathesis-Stress Model. So this would suggest that someone with OCD inherits genes or low levels of serotonin, and this could make them more vulnerable to OCD. But it could be that they have to experience something in the environment that would trigger that OCD, and therefore the environment links with their biology because they're more vulnerable if something particular happens in their environment. So the situation that we have at the minute with COVID-19, this could be triggering a lot of people's OCD. They might have never had it before. It could be something that runs in their families but they've never experienced themselves, and they have a genetic predisposition to it, but because all of this has happened, now they've started to develop obsessive compulsive characteristics, and this could manifest itself into OCD. Okay, so just to recap our evaluation, some positives are the research support, so we've got the twin study and we've got the first degree relative study. Then ethics, because it takes the blame away from the individual. It's a scientific methodology which gives it credibility, and therefore we can develop treatments from it, so biological treatments that can be given to an individual on the NHS. Then we have cause and effect, which is a negative, so our limitations. We can't establish cause and effect. All of this research is correlational, therefore we can't say that one thing definitely causes the OCD. It might be something that we haven't considered at all, such as irrational thinking or social learning theory. Then there are ethical issues with regards to the treatment. So a lot of the biological treatments that we give individuals for OCD are very addictive, such as anti-anxiety drugs, and we'll look at that in the next part. And then we have the idea of the environment, which must be considered, and this links into the Diathesis-Stress Model. So it could be a combination of the environment and the genetics just make an individual more susceptible to picking up OCD. It means that it's triggered a lot easier. So I've got an exam question for you to practice. So it's 6 marks, have a read of it, have a go. It should take you maybe like 7 minutes, 8 possibly. So have a read of that and have a go at it. Okay, so then we've got the mark scheme. So for the first question, distinguish between obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions are internal, so they're thoughts, they're cognitive, and compulsions are external and they are behaviours. And then the next part. So looking at those results, it suggests that OCD is partially genetic because heritability is between 45 and 60%, but because it's not 100%, there must be other factors that we have to take into account, such as the environment or irrational thinking, something along those lines. Okay, so now I would like you to complete the quiz on Classroom. And if you have any questions about the lesson, you can comment on the assignment.